Okay, we are rolling whenever you are ready.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So given Scott Pruitt's recent decision to eliminate the Obama-era Clean Power Plan in the U.S., it is now more important than ever to closely analyze the EPA policies under Scott Pruitt and also establish clean power goals throughout environmental activism. The plan is needed because there have never been federal limits on carbon emissions in the U.S. The U.S. second largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world is at 549,063 tons of CO2 in 2011, which is not very good. So that is from the UCS USA 2015. So whenever you consider how much the current greenhouse gas output is reducing the amount of gas pollutions that is already in our atmosphere, and it becomes critical to changing this worldwide because the unregulated emissions are reflected into our public health.
So chemically, when you consider CO2, here's a visual to help with the different risks that are associated with inducing CO2 into the body. So obviously you can see respiratory risks are the most obvious, but on a chemical level, CO2 will bind to hemoglobin in red blood cells, and that will inhibit the body's ability to use oxygen, and oxygen is needed for any function in the brain. And this is especially, kids are especially vulnerable to this, and also pregnant women. And so the EPA, let's talk about the EPA a little bit. The EPA is a federal agency that is responsible for protecting human health and the environment. And so in 2015, under the Obama era, the Clean Power Plan was finalized, but it wasn't yet enforced. And the Clean Power Plan, what it does, it targets the U.S. fossil fuel-based power sector, which is responsible for 31% of all U.S. carbon output. So this is a huge power sector that is responsible for massive emissions to the environment when you consider CO2. And that's according to Adams A. from Stanford University. So originally this plan was supposed to take place, effect in 2022 with full standards in place by 2030. And so this would be achieved by addressing states individually. States would be responsible for coming up with their own plans to meet these goals. And actions that states would take generally would be switching to more clean fossil fuels, such as natural gas, continuing to implement renewable technologies, as well as possible carbon capture technologies. This plan would also introduce new rules that would make new coal power plants difficult to build. That's according to Climate Reality Project.
Okay, so the history of the plan, Republicans are totally anti-climate change. They don't believe in it. They think that greenhouse gas they don't consider it a greenhouse gas. That's why they're so against it. And Obama, he just totally disagreed, and he just took charge on his own, and he moved forward with the plan, and he vetoed the Congress resolution of disapproval in December of 2015. After finalization of the plan was challenged by 27 states, but put on hold due to court decisions and upcoming 2016 election. Marcus J. Weiss now. So whenever Donald Trump took office, he is Republican, as you all know. He is a total climate change denier, and he decided to take away the Paris Climate Accord. It's an international plan to reduce climate change, and that really goes hand in hand with the Clean Power Plan.
And so the Clean Power Plan was finalized in 2015, as I said, but it immediately was challenged in court by more than half of the states. And this is because once the Clean Power Plan was finalized, it was very legally unstable because it didn't go through Congress. Obama sort of overstepped Congress to put this plan into action. So it was left with a lot of courtroom vulnerability. And so it was immediately challenged in court, and for that reason it was put on hold in 2015 and remains on hold to this day. So as we all know, in 2016, Trump took office, and this is the man on the right, Scott Pruitt, who he addressed as administrator of the EPA. And Scott Pruitt is also a human-caused climate change denier. He doesn't believe in it, or at least he says he doesn't. And so he is the new administrator of the EPA. And so what we want to point out here is that Pruitt clearly stands to gain personally from special interest groups and corporations that have capital invested in the power sector in the United States, largely carbon-based. Since 2002, Pruitt has received more than $300,000 in contributions from the fossil fuel industry. That's according to Marcus Gray at Vice News. And before he was appointed as EPA director, he was Attorney General. And during his time as Attorney General, he sued the EPA various times over regulations that limit air pollution haze in national parks, methane leaks from drilling, and also arsenic and mercury seeping from power plants. His announcement to discontinue the Clean Power Plan came in early October of this year. This decision directly endangers the health of all Americans, and all who inhabit Earth for that matter, because the US is the second most carbon producing nation in the world. So, despite his announcement, some analysts like Professor Charles Polstad at Stanford University predict that states will continue to move to more renewable technologies despite his decision, because renewable technologies continue to be developed to be more effective and their cost only goes down.
Okay, so if I could just see a show of hands of how many of you or any loved ones has asthma. Okay, that's like half, a little over half. Okay, so with cutting carbon pollutions, driving up climate crisis, but they don't end there. With less pollution in the air and more stable climate, the plan was projected to prevent 90,000 asthma attacks in children, 30,000 missed work and school days, and up to 3,600 premature deaths by 2030. Without the plan in place, we could see more sick kids, more expensive hospital visits, and more premature deaths, all of which could be prevented. That's from Philip W. Climate Reality.
Since this legislation is at a federal level, we can't simply just vote on it. So it becomes extremely important to become socially and politically involved at a grassroots level, so that we can make our demands for our public health into policy. So environmental groups have been mass mobilizing for years, fighting officials and policy that endanger public health and the environment. One such organization, locally based, is New Mexico 350. And according to their website, their goal is to dismantle the social license of the fossil fuel industry by shifting public opinion and by damaging their economic and political power through fossil fuel divestment campaigns. As a society as a whole, me and you, everybody in this room, everybody in the world, we're at a pivotal point. Either we make large sacrifices to reduce our grossly unsustainable overproduction and waste, including emissions, or we face grave environmental consequences in the very near future. There is action you could take now, this week, today. You could donate or volunteer your time with a local environmental activism group, and Mexico 350 being a very great option. If not this one, explore others, but be very careful because there's a lot of corporations, organizations that make lots of money off of this green movement. But New Mexico 350 is a very viable option. And also watch for Pruitt's name and the power plan, because it is still on hold, it is still current legislation. So be very notable to the news. Human-driven climate change is happening at an alarming rate. And unless we stand to combat damaging decisions like the one to disband the CPP, Clean Power Plan, we will suffer from worsening health effects and great losses to biodiversity in this and coming generations. Thank you very much. Questions, please.
It's really straightforward. You guys kind of
Yeah.
There's like no room for questions.
Lots of questions, folks. Who's got questions?
So, do you think part of the problem in implementing a lot of clean technology and sustainability stuff, kind of like what Elon Musk is doing with kind of the Tesla batteries you put in your house that stores solar energy over the day, that kind of puts you off the grid, and the establishment doesn't care. That kind of like we talked about with the Earthships, with the regulation of housing, they don't like that they can't fit it into their way of looking at it. Do you think that's going to be a very big obstacle with government, the power plants, and the power companies not really wanting anyone to be off the grid, or hey, I make my own power, this is great? Do you think that's going to be a big hurdle when it comes to kind of implementing a lot of this?
I think, yeah, definitely it will be a big hurdle. These companies have all these policies in place, so it makes it very difficult to get clean energy outside of their infrastructure on their grid. So it is pretty evident that a lot of these politicians are in bed with these corporations, and so it's going to be very difficult to change that policy. Absolutely.
So not that it will, it already is, right? A lot of states have actually passed legislation that requires this is just an example, guy who owned the pizza place where I had my first job also ran a farm, and he turned his whole farm solar to the extent that he was pushing power back into the grid and producing power, and they were sending him checks every month, right? Until the power company lobbied for legislation that made that illegal, and now by producing power, he gets charged more than just paying for power through the company. And so
it's ridiculous.
It's already happening.
Yeah, it's internal. And another example of this in this state, PNM just recently passed policy that people who use solar, those initiatives are downgraded tremendously. So if they were to sell back their energy that they produce from solar to PNM, they would buy it at a much lower rate. And that just happened this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, it's kind of off topic, but if you were to buy solar like 2005, you'd got 12 cents on the dollar per kilowatt, and today it's like 4% or 5%, 5 cents on the dollar per kilowatt is how much you can get back.
That's why activism at grassroots level is extremely important. We have to stand together. Yes, please.
Another one of our pollutions, like the main polluters, is corporations, and like the people don't really have a say in how corporations pollute or don't pollute, or they go to China, and you see the air in China, and it's super foggy on some days. They have to wear gas masks and use cans of air and stuff. So what are we going to do to combat corporations that don't care that they pollute the air? They go to another country where they don't have regulations.
I think it just really starts with like yourself and how you can help the earth, I guess. But whenever it's in higher hands like that, then you just really have to like take action and let like the government like see how important it is and how much we need it, and maybe it could go further into that.
But like we saw with Trump doesn't, he's a denier. He wants corporations to make more money, to do it however they can, and one way is by circumventing these, options to reduce their pollution. They're like, oh, we'll just throw it in the ocean. Instead of doing it the expensive, clean way, they'll just do it the cheap way.
And to add to Brittany's point, the worldwide problem of emissions, corporate emissions, is largely looked at as a social problem. Once it's emitted, it's like based on everybody to solve it. But it is these specific corporations that are the mass polluters. And so it's up to government agencies like the EPA to make policy to change this. But this is also very conflicted because the EPA is now run by Scott Pruitt. So that sort of feels like you're trapped in a place, but you're not. You have to act environmental activism.
Okay,
So there's to answer, and this is an extremely difficult question, and I appreciate you posing it because I think it gets at the heart of the matter of the political process, whether or not participating in parts of the political process have any effect on this, right? And some do, right? Voting really, really still matters at the local level. Of course, it still matters at the national level and state level, but you have a lot more sort of play with what's happening at the local level. So a couple of just examples of things that have been done to directly challenge corporations. There is actually a movement right now called the Children's Climate Change Movement. Landmark the landmark case that happened in Seattle, where a number, essentially this lawyer is in touch with a couple of professors here at CNM and at UNM, but she essentially organized a bunch of kids who were fighting a corporation that was in their neighborhood, right, who was producing a ton of toxic waste and not following EPA regulations for carbon emissions, and actually won, right? And so this was this moment in which the entire legislative system and judicial system was disrupted because they'd never seen children in court as plaintiffs before. And so it was this moment in which we, you know what I mean, there's the judicial process is actually still, to some extent, you know, not corrupted, whereas when we're looking at Congress and we're looking at the EPA, we're looking at government agencies right now, we have a moment in which if we do not replace a great deal of the people there, we are not going to see this stuff change at those levels. So just the side, like the legal process is actually still a place where we can start making concrete advancements in this fight, right? So, sorry. Any other questions?
Just the last thing to add is like Coca-Cola, you know, instead of using glass bottles and recycling like they were from the 1920s to 1950s, they started using plastic bottles. And now we got all kinds of plastic trash, you know what I mean? And that's cheaper for them. And then they did an ad campaign against us to make it feel like, oh, you guys are the ones polluting, when they're the ones who produce the bottles. They go to India, you get the clean water, and they destroy that city. So it's, you know, it's not really your fault. It's Coca-Cola's fault that they're destroying the environment.
I have a question. In Mexico 350, have they tried talking to the people who work at the corporations? Because maybe if they went on strike, then maybe the corporation would be like, because I doubt they're going to actually go into their own companies and do the jobs. So maybe.
Yeah. So 350 is actually a national corporation organization in Mexico. Has a base in it. So in Mexico, 350 is based in Mexico, but it's part of a national thing. And so this organization funds lobbyists. So yes, those lobbyists are in Washington, and they are speaking to politicians.
That's a tough one.
But yeah, it is a tough one. But like Jeffrey said, we should base a lot of our attention on the legal system because that's where we are seeing change happening and wins happening in our favor. And if you plan to be around in 10, 30 years, this is going to affect everybody's health. So you must get involved.
The immediate answer to that question, to another problem with that, is are the workers in those organizations unionized? Because if they're not, they have no power to go on strike. When you go on strike and you're not unionized, you get fired and they replace you the next day. It's, you know what I mean? So that's a little bit of a difficult one. But it's a great idea. Sort of approaches another problem with corporations that we have right now, is that workers used to have a lot of power to do things like this. Really, we don't very much anymore, at least not in this country. So.
A lot of those corporations don't like when people unionize.
Well, no, I mean, it definitely cuts into their leadership's profit margins. Another sort of idea here, right, is it's also the positive side, right? So we're asking corporations to stop doing a lot of things, but a lot of the way that a lot of other countries have actually accomplished this is by offering them better opportunities and offering them incentives to stop producing carbon, right? And so we're asking folks to divest from the fossil fuel industry. But when you think like the University of New Mexico would not exist today. Over 50% of the funds for the University of New Mexico come directly from the fossil fuel industry. It's like same thing with CNM. I think it's a little less here because we get a little more funding from other spots. But like this is the case for a lot of universities. A lot of public services come directly from the fossil fuel production and extraction industry. And so we have to start thinking about, if we're asking folks to change, where exactly are we asking them to go to, and how do we start participating in things that offer incentive, right, for organizations to shift their focus, right? And I know that 350 is doing a little bit of that work, but and they're certainly connected with a network of people who are doing some too. So that's just, again, further research if you want to keep following these ideas. Awesome job, folks. For the sake of excellent conversations today, folks, we have we're gonna have to do Crystal and Megan and Edsel on Thursday, if that's okay. Good, cool. All right. You all good? Where's Megan and Denzel? Oh, there you are. Hi. Are you guys good with that?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful job. Really wonderful job. Oops, it's still recording. That's it.